We had mentioned earlier we were going to talk to the CEO of Bonterra. It's George Fink, who is joining us from Calgary. And here's a company that this week said it would be suspending its dividend and plans to defer spending outside the $25 million it has already committed. George, thanks very much for being with us. Appreciate it.
You're welcome, and certainly appreciate the opportunity.
Well, what does this all mean? I mean, we just showed our audience the further declines today. How does that impact you?
I think that it's going to impact us the way we released, where we certainly are going to cut back a whole lot or delay the expenditures of our CapEx for the year until there's an adjustment to the pricing. And from the standpoint of the dividend, we very reluctantly lowered it or took it away totally after paying a dividend for 20-some years and paying out over $1.1 billion of dividends. It's a tough thing for our shareholders to feel that kind of a pinch. But it's necessary for not just Bonterra, but for a lot of companies to take drastic measures at this point to try to make sure that we get through this, and hope it's not for a long period of time.
George, what was that conversation like when you and the team had to decide whether or not you were going to make the dividend move?
It was pretty well agreed to by all board members that we had to do drastic steps, and we looked at maybe just trying to reduce it by about 80%, but we decided for the time being to go all the way and eliminate it totally. And that's the first time that we paid zero dividends, as I mentioned, for the life of the company over 20 years.
And can you give us a sense on when you're making these moves, simultaneously, what kind of outlook for oil prices are you baking into your own internal forecasts? I only ask, we had the head of Birchcliff on earlier, who seemed quite optimistic that energy prices would not be able to stay at these reduced levels over the long term. So how do you feel about that?
Well, if you look at some of the fundamentals, and the big one would be where I think it's a situation that's a bit of a feud between the Russians and the Saudis. But remember that the Saudi Arabia just produces, they'll move up to about 12 million barrels a day, and the OPEC countries produce about 32 million barrels a day. So you've got OPEC countries that are suffering just as much as everyone else in the world, and they're having a tough time. So they're likely putting a whole lot of pressure on the Saudis to get something resolved, because they can't survive for a very long period of time. And the other factor is, as well, is that it sounds like the prince in Saudi is in shaky ground as well. So those are reasons why it could turn a little bit quicker than what everyone is projecting. And a lot of us are going to be cutting down in our production volumes just because of the situation where the high-cost wells will shut in. They're not economic, so we'll shut in, and we'll continue producing wells that are still economic at these prices.
Maybe you could shed a little light on what cutting down on production means for your employees and the subject of layoffs, because as there's a growing conversation around the outlook for the Canadian economy and fears around a recession, a lot of people point to Alberta and the hard-hit energy sector and what that means in terms of jobs. Is there anything you can tell us about that?
Well, you really don't know for sure what will happen, and you can't say that we will not do any layoffs. But throughout my career in the oil and gas industry, dating back for a lot of years, I have not had a policy of laying off during tough times like this. We will look at different options that are available, and maybe we do a reduction in pay, or we do some other things that help the bottom line for the company. But if you've got good employees and you think this is going to be relatively short-lived, I don't believe it's the time to get rid of good employees. And so we likely will be considering that in our options, but I can't say we will not do it, but we likely will not do it.
And we're almost out of time, George, but just speaking of your employees, what's the road ahead? I mean, look at all the businesses we've seen around the globe that have said stay home. How are you going to approach addressing any workplace fears over the spread of COVID-19?
Well, I think that if one of us was affected at the office, that almost eliminates the whole workforce. So what we would have to do would be we would have to work from home, and any public things that we would do, it would be by telephone, call in, and everyone would hook into it. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot of pressure on the telephone systems, but we have to just try to do everything and take every measure to make sure that we're not a company that's going to be spreading the virus.
George, good to get your perspective. Thanks for joining us this morning. George Fink, the CEO of Bonterra Energy, joining us from Calgary.